Senator Kennedy destroys Adam Schiff. If you don't like America, leave. The air in the congressional chamber was thick with anticipation, the kind that settles over a room when everyone knows something big is about to unfold. The polished wooden desks gleamed under the bright lights, and the low hum of murmured conversations filled the space, as lawmakers, staffers, and spectators settled in for what promised to be a lively session. At the center of it all stood Senator John Neely Kennedy, the Republican from Louisiana, his sharp eyes scanning the room with a mix of calm confidence and a glint of mischief. Known for his quick wit and no-nonsense approach, Kennedy had a reputation for cutting through political noise with a razor-sharp clarity that left his opponents scrambling. Today, he was poised to take on Representative Adam Schiff, a prominent Democrat whose polished demeanor and carefully crafted arguments had made him a formidable figure in Washington. The stakes were high, not because of any single policy or vote, but because this was a clash of ideas, a battle of principles that would resonate far beyond the walls of the Capitol. Kennedy, with his Southern charm and knack for plain-spoken truths, was ready to make his mark. The session began with the usual formalities, gavels, banging names called, and procedural motions dispatched with mechanical precision. But the undercurrent of tension was unmistakable. Schiff, seated across the chamber, had been vocal in recent weeks, pushing a series of proposals that had stirred debate across the country. His ideas, rooted in a vision of sweeping change, had drawn both fervent support and fierce criticism. To his supporters, Schiff was a principled advocate for progress, a man unafraid to challenge the status quo. To his detractors, his policies veered too far from the values that had long defined the nation's identity. Kennedy, ever the skeptic of grand promises, saw in Schiff's rhetoric a disconnect from the everyday concerns of the people he represented. As the agenda moved to a discussion on domestic policy, Kennedy leaned forward in his seat, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk, a sign he was ready to dive in. The chairman called on Schiff first, and the California representative rose with the confidence of a seasoned orator. His voice was steady, measured as he laid out his case. He spoke of systemic issues, of the need for bold reforms to address inequality and modernize the economy. His words were carefully chosen, each sentence polished to appeal to both the heart and the mind. He gestured broadly, his hands slicing through the air, as he outlined a vision of a transformed America, one where new policies would level the playing field and open opportunities for all. The chamber listened closely, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Schiff's argument was compelling on its surface, a tapestry of ideals woven with data and anecdotes. But to Kennedy, it was a tapestry with too many loose threads, a plan that sounded noble but ignored the practical realities of the people it claimed to serve. As Schiff concluded, the chairman turned to Kennedy, who rose slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with a deliberate calm. The room grew quieter, the anticipation palpable. Kennedy's presence commanded attention not through theatrics, but through the quiet authority of a man who knew exactly what he wanted to say. He began with a disarming smile, his Louisiana drawl softening the edges of his words, but doing nothing to dull their impact. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the chamber, "I've listened to my colleague from California, and I'll give him this. He's got a way with words. But let me tell you something about words. They're like a good gumbo. They might taste fine going down, but if the ingredients don't hold up, you're gonna feel it later." A ripple of laughter spread through the room, breaking the tension for a moment. Kennedy's knack for folksy analogies was legendary, and he was just getting started. He paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back as he began to dismantle Schiff's arguments with surgical precision. Representative Schiff wants us to believe that his plan is the answer to all our problems, Kennedy said, his tone shifting from light to serious. But let's talk about what his plan really means for the folks back home. The people I talked to, the farmers in Louisiana, the small business owners, the teachers, they don't want grand promises. They want solutions that make sense. Solutions that respect the way they live their lives. He paused, letting his words sink in, his eyes sweeping the room to gauge the reaction. Schiff, seated, now watched with a tight expression, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest of his chair. Kennedy's argument was grounded in a simple but powerful idea that the values of hard work, personal responsibility, and community were the bedrock of American life. He didn't shy away from acknowledging the challenges Schiff had raised: inequality, economic strain, but he framed them differently. "We don't fix what's broken by tearing down what works," he said, his voice rising slightly. "We don't help people by promising them the moon and then handing them a bill they can't pay." He pointed to specific elements of Schiff's proposal, questioning their feasibility. "Take this idea of overhauling the economy overnight," he said. "Sounds nice in a speech, but when you start looking at the numbers, it's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. The math doesn't add up, and the people who'll pay the price are the ones who can least afford it." The chamber was rapt now, hanging on Kennedy's every word. He had a way of making complex issues feel personal, of bringing the debate back to the lives of ordinary Americans. He recounted a conversation he'd had with a small business owner in Baton Rouge, a woman who'd built her company from the ground up. She told me, "Senator, I don't need the government to remake my life. I just need it to get out of my way so I can keep doing what I do." "That's what we're talking about here," Kennedy said, his voice steady but passionate. "It's about trusting people to know what's best for themselves, not telling them they need a new system to fix their problems." Schiff shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening as Kennedy continued. The senator's words weren't just a critique of policy, they were a challenge to the very foundation of Schiff's approach. Kennedy wasn't attacking Schiff personally. He didn't need to. His argument was aimed at the ideas, peeling back the layers of rhetoric to expose what he saw as their flaws. "My colleague talks about equality," Kennedy said, "and I'm all for fairness. But fairness doesn't mean taking from one to give to another. It means giving everyone a chance to stand on their own 2 feet. That's the America I know, and that's the America I'm fighting for." As Kennedy spoke, he wove in stories from his constituents, each one carefully chosen to illustrate his point. There was the farmer who worried about new regulations choking his livelihood, the single mother who relied on her small business to keep her family afloat, the veteran who wanted nothing more than to live in a country that honored his service. These weren't abstract talking points, they were real people, and Kennedy's ability to bring their voices into the chamber was what made his argument so compelling. He wasn't just debating Schiff. He was speaking for those who felt their concerns were being drowned out by lofty promises. The tension in the room was electric as Kennedy neared the end of his remarks. He turned directly to Schiff, his gaze steady but not hostile. "Representative Schiff, I respect your right to your views," he said, his tone measured. "But when those views start leading us down a path that ignores the people we serve, I've got to call it like I see it. We don't need a revolution to make America better. We need to listen to the folks who make this country work every single day." The chamber erupted in applause from some corners, while others remained silent, the divide in the room mirroring the broader divide in the country. As Kennedy took his seat, the chairman called for a brief recess, but the energy in the room lingered. Staffers whispered to each other, and spectators in the gallery leaned forward, eager for the next round. Schiff, for his part, was already preparing his response, his face a mask of determination. But Kennedy had set the tone, framing the debate as a choice between practical solutions and unrealistic ideals. His words had landed with force, not because they were loud or aggressive, but because they were clear-rooted in a deep belief in the values he championed. The stage was set for a clash that would only grow more intense, and Kennedy, with his sharp mind and unshakable conviction, was ready for whatever came next. The congressional chamber buzzed with restless energy as the recess ended and the gavel struck, signaling the resumption of the session. The air felt heavier now, charged with the weight of the opening exchange between Senator John Neely Kennedy and Representative Adam Schiff. The spectators in the gallery leaned forward, their eyes darting between the two men, sensing that the debate was about to escalate. Kennedy sat calmly at his desk, his hands folded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. His earlier remarks had set the tone, framing Schiff's proposals as disconnected from the realities of everyday Americans. Now it was Schiff's turn to respond, and the room braced for the counterattack. But Kennedy, with his keen instincts and unyielding commitment to his principles, was ready to meet whatever came his way. Schiff rose, his posture rigid, his expression a mix of resolve and controlled indignation. He adjusted his tie, a subtle gesture that seemed to ground him, and began to speak. His voice carried the same polished cadence as before, but there was a sharper edge now, a hint of defiance. "I appreciate Senator Kennedy's passion," Schiff began his words. "Measured, but pointed, but passion alone doesn't solve problems. We need bold ideas, ideas that address the challenges facing our nation head-on." He launched into a defense of his proposals, emphasizing the need for systemic change to tackle issues like economic disparity and access to opportunity. He painted a picture of an America that could be one where every citizen had a fair shot, regardless of their background. His rhetoric was lofty, filled with appeals to justice and progress, and it resonated with those in the chamber who shared his vision. But Kennedy wasn't swayed. As Schiff spoke, the senator's eyes narrowed slightly, his mind already dissecting the arguments. He jotted a few notes on a pad, his pen moving with quick, deliberate strokes. Schiff's vision, while eloquent, leaned heavily on sweeping reforms that Kennedy believed overlooked the practical needs of the people he represented. The representative's plan called for significant government intervention, new regulations, expanded programs, and increased spending. To Schiff, these were necessary steps to build a more equitable society. To Kennedy, they were a recipe for overreach, a one-size-fits-all approach that ignored the diversity of American life. When Schiff finished, the chairman turned to Kennedy, who stood with the same deliberate calm that had marked his earlier remarks. The room grew quiet, the anticipation almost tangible. Kennedy adjusted his glasses, took a sip of water, and began. "Well, folks," he said, his Louisiana drawl cutting through the silence, "I've heard a lot of talk about big ideas and bold plans. And I'll tell you, it sounds real nice, like a shiny new pickup truck parked in your driveway. But when you pop the hood and take a look, you realize it's all flash and no engine." A chuckle rippled through the chamber, easing the tension for a moment. Kennedy's ability to lighten the mood was a gift, but it was always a prelude to something sharper. He stepped away from his desk, his hands gesturing as he spoke. "Representative Schiff wants us to believe that the answer to every problem is a bigger government program." Kennedy said, his tone steady but firm. "But let me tell you something about the folks I represent. They don't want a handout. They don't want someone in Washington telling them how to live their lives. They want a government that works for them, not one that works them over." He paused, letting the words settle, his eyes scanning the room. Schiff sat still, his face unreadable, but the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed his discomfort. Kennedy zeroed in on one of Schiff's key proposals, a plan to expand federal oversight of small businesses to ensure compliance with new equity standards. Now, let's talk about this idea of putting more rules on our small businesses, Kennedy said, his voice taking on a note of incredulity. I talked to a fella in Shreveport not long ago, runs a little hardware store. Been in his family for 3 generations. He's not out there trying to change the world. He's just trying to keep his doors open. And now we're going to tell him he's got to fill out a stack of forms and jump through hoops, just to prove he's playing fair. That's not helping him. That's hurting him. Kennedy's words were simple, but they carried weight, grounded in the real-world struggles of his constituents. He turned to face Schiff, directly, his expression earnest but unwavering. My colleague talks about fairness, and I'm all for that, Kennedy said. But fairness doesn't mean strangling our small businesses with red tape. It doesn't mean taxing folks who are already stretched thin. It means giving people the tools to succeed on their own terms. The chamber was silent now, the gravity of Kennedy's argument sinking in. He wasn't just challenging Schiff's policy, he was challenging the mindset behind it, the idea that Washington could engineer a perfect society from the top down. Then came the moment that would define the debate. Kennedy leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a quieter, more deliberate tone. Representative Schiff, if you think the way to fix America is to remake it in a way that doesn't respect what makes it great, then I've got to say you don't like the America I know. And if you don't like America, leave. The words landed like a thunderclap, sharp and unapologetic. The chamber erupted, some in applause, others in murmurs of shock. Schiff's eyes widened briefly before he regained his composure. But the impact was clear. Kennedy's statement wasn't just a rhetorical jab. It was a declaration of his belief in the enduring strength of American values, values he saw as under threat. Kennedy didn't linger on the moment. He pivoted back to his broader point, his voice steady as he continued. Now, I'm not saying we don't have problems, he said. We've got plenty to work on. But the answer isn't to tear down what's working. It's to build on it, to trust the people who get up every day and make this country run. He recounted another story, this time about a teacher in New Orleans who'd told him she didn't need new mandates from Washington. She needed the freedom to teach her students the way she knew best. That's what we're fighting for, Kennedy said. Not some grand vision that sounds good on paper, but falls apart when you try to make it work. As Kennedy wrapped up, the chamber was a mix of reactions. Some lawmakers clapped enthusiastically, others sat in stony silence. Schiff, preparing to respond, scribbled notes furiously, his face set in determination. But Kennedy had seized the momentum, his words resonating with those who shared his belief in practical, grounded solutions. He took his seat, his expression calm but resolute, knowing he'd struck a chord. The debate was far from over, but Kennedy had made it clear he was here to defend the America he knew, and he wouldn't back down. The echo of Senator John Neely Kennedy's words still hung in the air as the congressional chamber settled into an uneasy quiet. His bold declaration, "If you don't like America, leave," had ignited a firestorm not just within the walls of the Capitol, but in the wider world beyond. The spectators in the gallery whispered among themselves, their faces a mix of awe, amusement, and apprehension. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle shifted in their seats, some nodding in approval, others exchanging glances of concern. Representative Adam Schiff sat at his desk, his pen tapping rhythmically against a notepad, his expression a carefully constructed mask of composure. But the tension in his posture betrayed the impact of Kennedy's verbal salvo. The Louisiana senator, with his sharp wit and unwavering conviction, had turned the debate into something more than a policy disagreement. It was now a public spectacle, a clash of visions for the nation's future. And Kennedy, with his knack for connecting with everyday Americans, was firmly in the driver's seat. As the chairman called for the next speaker, the energy in the room remained electric. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, his hands folded, his eyes scanning the chamber with a quiet confidence. He knew his words had landed hard, not because they were cruel or inflammatory, but because they were direct-rooted in a belief that resonated with many, that America's strength lay in its people, not in the grand schemes of Washington elites. Schiff, however, was not one to back down. He rose again, his voice steady, but laced with a new intensity. Senator Kennedy's remarks are colorful, as always. He began his tone measured, but pointed. But they do little to address the real challenges we face. Words like his may win applause, but they don't solve problems. Schiff launched into a rebuttal, doubling down on his vision for reform. He spoke of data statistics on economic inequality stories of families struggling to make ends meet, and framed his proposals as the only path to a fairer future. His argument was polished, logical, and delivered with the conviction of someone who believed he was on the right side of history. But Schiff's response, while articulate, lacked the visceral connection that Kennedy had so effortlessly forged. The senator's earlier stories of farmers, small business owners, and teachers had painted a vivid picture of real people, their struggles and aspirations. Schiff's statistics, though compelling to some, felt abstract by comparison, a lecture rather than a conversation. As he spoke, Kennedy jotted occasional notes, his expression unreadable but attentive. He wasn't just listening to Schiff's words, he was reading the room, gauging the reactions of his colleagues and the spectators above. He could sense the tide shifting the way his plain-spoken truths had struck a chord with those who felt overlooked by the kind of sweeping reforms Schiff championed. When Schiff concluded, the chamber was quieter than before, the applause polite but restrained. The chairman turned to Kennedy, who stood slowly, his movements deliberate, almost theatrical in their restraint. "Well, folks," he began, his drawl cutting through the silence like a warm breeze. "I've listened to my colleague from California, and I'll give him credit. He's got a lot of numbers. But numbers don't tell the whole story. People do." The room leaned in, captivated by Kennedy's ability to boil complex issues down to their essence. He stepped away from his desk, his hands gesturing as he spoke, his voice steady but infused with a quiet passion. "Representative Schiff wants to talk about fairness, and I'm all for that. But let me tell you about the kind of fairness I hear about from the folks back home." Kennedy launched into a story about a diner owner in Lafayette, a man named Tom, who'd been running his small restaurant for 20 years. "Tom gets up at 4 a.m. every day to open that diner," Kennedy said. "He's not out there chasing headlines or dreaming up big government programs. He's serving coffee to truck drivers, eggs to construction workers, and pie to folks who just want a place to sit and talk. And you know what Tom told me? He said, 'Senator, I don't need new rules telling me how to run my business. I just need the government to let me do what I do best.'" The chamber was silent, the weight of Kennedy's words sinking in. He wasn't just telling a story, he was giving voice to the countless Americans who felt their way of life was being overshadowed by policies that didn't account for their realities. Outside the chamber, the reaction to Kennedy's remarks was already spreading. Clips of his speech had hit social media, shared by commentators and everyday citizens alike. On platforms like X, posts praising Kennedy's straightforwardness began to trend, with users quoting his "If you don't like America, leave" line alongside messages of support. Finally, someone saying what we're all thinking, one post read, garnering thousands of likes. Another user wrote, "Kennedy gets it, stop trying to fix what ain't broken." But not everyone was on board. Critics of Kennedy, particularly those aligned with Schiff's progressive vision, pushed back, accusing the senator of oversimplifying complex issues. "This kind of rhetoric is divisive," one commentator tweeted. "We need solutions, not sound bites." Yet even the criticism only amplified the debate, making Kennedy's words a focal point of national conversation. Back in the chamber, Kennedy continued undeterred by the growing buzz outside. He turned his attention to another of Schiff's proposals, a plan to increase taxes to fund new social programs. "Now, I'm not saying we don't need to help folks who are struggling," Kennedy said, his tone earnest. "But when you start raising taxes on the very people who are keeping our economy moving, the small business owners, the workers, the families who are already stretched thin, you're not solving problems, you're creating them." He recounted a conversation with a mechanic in Monroe, a woman named Sarah, who'd told him she was barely making ends meet. "Sarah said to me, 'Senator, every time I turn around there's a new tax or fee. How am I supposed to keep my shop open?' That's the question we need to be asking." Kennedy said, his voice rising slightly. "Not how many new programs we can dream up, but how we can make life easier for folks like Sarah." Schiff, listening intently, scribbled notes, his face a mix of frustration and determination. He raised his hand to interject, and the chairman allowed him a brief response. "Senator Kennedy's stories are compelling," Schiff said, "but they don't change the fact that our system isn't working for everyone. We can't ignore the data, the evidence that shows millions of Americans are being left behind." It was a solid counter, but it lacked the emotional pull of Kennedy's approach. The senator's ability to humanize the debate, to make it about real people rather than abstract numbers, was proving to be his greatest strength. Kennedy seized the moment, his response swift and incisive. "Data's important, no question," he said, nodding toward Schiff. "But data doesn't pay the bills. Data doesn't get up at dawn to open a diner or fix a car. People do. And those people deserve a government that trusts them, not one that tries to control every part of their lives." The chamber erupted in applause from some corners, the sound reverberating off the walls. Kennedy's words weren't just a rebuttal. They were a rallying cry, a reminder that the heart of the debate was about who got to decide what America should be. As the session drew to a close, the impact of Kennedy's performance was undeniable. He had taken Schiff's polished arguments and turned them into a liability, framing them as out of touch with the realities of everyday life. The senator's connection with his audience, both in the chamber and beyond, was rooted in his ability to speak plainly, to cut through the noise with a clarity that resonated. Schiff, for all his eloquence, struggled to match that connection, his responses sounding more like a lecture than a conversation. The debate had exposed a fundamental divide, not just between two men, but between two visions of what America should be. As the lawmakers filed out of the chamber, Kennedy lingered for a moment, shaking hands with colleagues and exchanging a few words with staffers. The buzz on social media continued to grow, with clips of his speech circulating widely. The nation was watching, and Kennedy's message was clear. He was here to defend the values that had made America strong, and he wasn't afraid to call out those who, in his view, threatened those values. The stage was set for the final chapter of this clash, and Kennedy, with his unshakable resolve, was ready to see it through. The congressional chamber, once crackling with the heat of debate, had settled into a quieter hum as the session neared its end. The clash between Senator John Neely Kennedy and Representative Adam Schiff had left an indelible mark not just on those present, but on the countless Americans who had caught wind of the exchange through news clips, social media, and heated conversations at dinner tables across the country. Kennedy's bold statement, "If you don't like America, leave," had become a lightning rod, sparking admiration from some and criticism from others. But as the dust settled, it was clear that Kennedy had emerged as a powerful voice, not just for his constituents in Louisiana, but for those who felt their values were being drowned out by the clamor of grand promises and sweeping reforms. Now, as the session drew to a close, the focus shifted from the fireworks of the debate to the deeper meaning behind it all. This was the moment for reflection, for drawing lessons from the clash, and for charting a path forward that honored the principles Kennedy held dear. Kennedy stood at his desk, his posture relaxed, but his presence commanding. The chamber was less crowded now, with some lawmakers having slipped out to catch flights or attend other meetings, but the gallery remained packed, the spectators hanging on to see how this would end. The senator's earlier remarks had painted him as a defender of the everyday American, a man who spoke not in abstract theories, but in the language of real people, farmers, mechanics, diner owners, and teachers. His ability to weave their stories into the debate had given his arguments a weight that Schiff's polished rhetoric struggled to match. But Kennedy wasn't here to gloat or revel in the moment. His goal was bigger: to remind everyone, from his colleagues to the public, that the heart of America lay in its people, not in the halls of power. The chairman called for closing remarks, and Kennedy rose, his hands resting lightly on the desk, his eyes scanning the room with a quiet intensity. "Folks," he began, his Louisiana drawl warm and familiar, "we've had quite a day here, haven't we?" A soft chuckle rippled through the chamber, easing the tension. Kennedy's knack for disarming a room was unmatched, but it was always a prelude to something deeper. "I've listened to my colleague Representative Schiff, and I respect his right to his views. That's what makes this country great. Everybody gets a say. But I want to talk about what I've learned today and what I hope we can all take away from this." He stepped away from his desk, his movements deliberate, as if inviting the room to join him in a moment of reflection. "This debate," he said, "wasn't just about policies or programs. It was about who we are as a country. It was about the folks out there, the ones who get up every day, work hard, pay their bills, and try to make a better life for their families. Those are the people I'm here for, and I know many of you are too." He gestured toward his colleagues, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "When we talk about making America better, we've got to start with them. Not with big plans that sound good on paper, but don't work in the real world. Not with ideas that look nice in a speech, but leave folks like Tom, the diner owner in Lafayette, or Sarah, the mechanic in Monroe, wondering how they're going to make it through the month." Kennedy's words were a call to return to first principles, to the values he believed defined America: hard work, personal responsibility, and community. He didn't shy away from acknowledging the challenges Schiff had raised: economic struggles, disparities in opportunity, but he framed them in a way that put people at the center. "We don't fix problems by tearing down what's good," he said, his voice rising slightly. "We fix them by building on what works, by trusting people to know what's best for themselves, by giving them the freedom to live their lives without a bunch of new rules and taxes weighing them down." The chamber was silent now, the weight of his words settling over the room like a blanket. He turned to face Schiff, who sat with a tight expression, his hands clasped on the desk. "Representative Schiff, I know you believe in your vision," Kennedy said, his tone earnest but firm, "and I respect that. But I believe in an America where people are trusted to make their own way, where the government's job is to help, not control. That's the America I know, and that's the America I'm fighting for." The words weren't an attack. They were a statement of principle, a line in the sand that Kennedy had drawn with clarity and conviction. The chamber erupted in applause from some corners, while others remained quiet. The divide in the room reflecting the broader divide in the nation. But Kennedy wasn't done. He shifted his focus to the broader lesson, the one he wanted to leave with everyone in the room and beyond. "Here's what I hope we can all take away from today," he said, his voice softening. "We're going to have disagreements, That's part of living in a free country. But those disagreements don't have to tear us apart. We can argue, we can debate, but at the end of the day, we've got to remember we're all on the same team. We're all Americans, and we all want what's best for this country. He paused, letting the words sink in his eyes, sweeping the room. The way we get there is by listening not just to each other in this room, but to the folks out there who are counting on us to get it right. Kennedy's message was one of unity, but not the kind that glossed over differences. It was a call for respectful disagreement, for a debate grounded in shared goals rather than personal attacks. He told one final story this time about a community center in Baton Rouge, where volunteers came together to help families hit hard by a recent storm. Those folks didn't care who you voted for, Kennedy said. They didn't care about your politics or your plans. They just showed up, rolled up their sleeves, and got to work. That's the America I believe in. An America where we help each other, where we solve problems together, not by pointing fingers, but by lending a hand. The chamber was rapt, now the senator's words striking a chord that transcended the political divide. Even those who disagreed with Kennedy couldn't help but feel the sincerity in his voice, the authenticity of his commitment to the people he served. Schiff, for his part, listened quietly, his earlier intensity softened by the senator's call for unity. The debate had been fierce, but Kennedy's closing remarks shifted the tone, reminding everyone that the goal wasn't to win an argument, but to build a better future. As Kennedy took his seat, the applause was louder this time, crossing party lines in a way that hadn't happened earlier. The chairman called the session to a close, and lawmakers began to gather their papers, their conversations buzzing with reflections on what they'd just witnessed. Outside, the reaction continued to spread with social media posts praising Kennedy's ability to speak for the common person. This is why we need more leaders like Kennedy. One user wrote on X, "He gets it. America is about people, not politics." Another post read, "Kennedy just showed us how to disagree without being disagreeable." The criticism was still there. Of course, some called his rhetoric too simplistic, others accused him of dodging the complexities of Schiff's proposals, but the overwhelming sentiment was that Kennedy had connected not just with his base, but with anyone who valued straightforwardness and principle. The lesson of the day was clear, and it was one Kennedy had driven home with every word. Disagreements are inevitable, but they don't have to divide us. The path forward, he argued, was through respectful debate, through listening to the people who make America what it is, and through a commitment to solutions that empower rather than control. It was a lesson with roots in the values Kennedy held dear, values of community responsibility and trust in the individual. But it was also a lesson for everyone, a reminder that even in the heat of political battle, there's room for common ground. As the chamber emptied, Kennedy lingered for a moment, shaking hands with a few colleagues and exchanging nods with staffers. His face was calm, but there was a spark in his eyes, a sense that he'd done what he came to do. He'd stood up for the America he believed in, and he'd done it in a way that invited others to join him, not through division, but through a shared commitment to the people they served. The debate with Schiff had been a clash of ideas, but it was also a chance to show that principled disagreement could lead to something better. And as Kennedy walked out of the chamber, he carried with him the quiet confidence of a man who knew he'd left a mark, not just on the debate, but on the way forward for a nation that needed it.